The night was so still you could hear the old church breathing. Wooden pews groaned in the dark, the stained glass windows swallowing every moonbeam, and at the very front stood a man who looked like the shadows were pulling at him. Pastor John Reeves, a white preacher with a Bible in one hand and a tremble in the other. His whisper cracked the silence as he stared at the empty room, saying he'd seen something he couldn't turn away from anymore, something he should have spoken out about years ago, something that had been sitting right under his feet, buried in this very building, in this community, in the history he'd been raised to protect. He took a shaky breath like the truth itself was choking him, and in that moment, you could almost feel the weight pressing down on him, the heaviness of secrets he wished he never found. This wasn't the kind of fear that comes from danger. This was the fear that comes when a man realizes his silence has harmed people he claimed to love, and he knew, deep down, that once he opened his mouth, nothing about this town would ever be the same. My name is Simmons, and welcome to Chronicles of Black. If you're here right now, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop your thoughts in the comments, because this story is going to shake your spirit. Now let's walk into it together. Just a few miles away lived Elijah Carter, a quiet man, the kind of black man who worked twice as hard for half the credit and still kept his voice steady, even when the world pushed him to the edge. He was in his late 30s, shoulders always a little tense, eyes always a little tired, not from age, but from years of holding himself together in a country that kept testing his patience. He was the kind of person who rarely complained, because he'd grown up learning that when you're black, complaining doesn't fix your life, it just labels you as angry. Elijah carried his struggles the way some men carry old injuries. You didn't see the wound, but you saw the way he moved with it, the way he braced himself around white co-workers who treated him like a threat just because he had a deeper voice, the way he forced a polite smile for the neighbor who always asked, "So, you live around here?" as if his presence needed permission, the way he grew tense whenever a patrol car slowed down near him, even when he'd done nothing but exist. He never told anyone how much all of it wore him down. He just lived through it, day after day, praying for a break that never seemed to come. Pastor Reeves knew Elijah, not well, not deeply, but he'd seen him slip quietly into the back pew on Sundays, head bowed, hands folded. Elijah was never one to draw attention. He came for the message, sat alone, and left before the chatter began, and Pastor Reeves knew exactly why. There were people in that congregation who smiled at him in the morning, and crossed the street to avoid him in the afternoon. The preacher had always pretended he didn't notice, pretended his sermons on kindness were enough, pretended his church wasn't built on land that once belonged to a black family whose name history had conveniently erased, pretended he didn't know about the letters tucked away in the church office, letters from past church leaders bragging about keeping certain folks out, to maintain the neighborhood the way they wanted it, letters he'd read years ago and closed his eyes to. But that night, as he stood alone in the sanctuary, that denial finally shattered. He pressed both hands to his pulpit, knuckles white, breath uneven. He whispered to the empty room, "I should have spoken sooner." His voice carried a kind of guilt that doesn't just sit in your chest, it claws at you. He had spent years preaching love while ignoring the injustice sitting right outside his church doors. He'd watched men like Elijah come and go, carrying pain this town refused to acknowledge. Pain he'd pretended wasn't his responsibility, but something had shifted in him. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the discovery he stumbled onto in the church archives earlier that day. Documents showing exactly how much the church gained from the displacement of black families decades ago. Maybe it was realizing that every sermon he'd ever preached about truth meant nothing if he denied the truth living under his own roof. Whatever it was, the weight crashed over him all at once. He leaned over the pulpit as if confessing to the silence itself. "God forgive me. I stayed quiet. I let comfort win." And for the first time in his life, the preacher understood that his silence had cost people more than he ever imagined. He paced the aisle with slow, haunted steps, glancing at the walls like they were closing in. He remembered the old church founders he'd admired, the men he'd been taught to honor, and he finally saw them clearly not as heroes of faith, but as men who built their power on the suffering of others. Men who passed down their privilege like a family inheritance, while pretending racism was a thing of the past. Men who forced families like Elijah's to rebuild their lives from nothing, again and again. The preacher felt sick, truly sick, because the truth was simple. His church had benefited from black pain, from black silence, from black fear, and he had spent years preaching about compassion without ever confronting that truth. He dropped into the first pew, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. He whispered the question that had been clawing at him for months. If love is real, why didn't I fight for it when it mattered? The empty church didn't answer, but he knew what he had to do. He knew the moment he spoke publicly, people would turn on him. Old donors would cut ties. Members who sat in the front row every Sunday would walk out. Friends would call him dramatic, delusional, or worse. Folks in town would say he'd lost his mind, or accuse him of pushing some agenda they didn't want to confront. He knew all of that. And still, he rose from that pew, breathing hard, gripping the back of it as if steadying himself for a storm he could no longer avoid, because the truth had been buried long enough, and he couldn't live with himself if he buried it again. With one last look at the dark sanctuary, he whispered, "Tomorrow, I speak." And in that moment, he accepted something he'd been running from his entire life. The cost of telling the truth might destroy his reputation, but staying silent would destroy his soul. Elijah woke up every morning with the same quiet hope that maybe, just maybe today would be different. Not perfect, not painless, just different. A day where he wouldn't have to brace himself before leaving the house. A day where he could breathe without waiting for someone else's fear or assumptions to cut the air in half. But every time he stepped outside, the world reminded him of the script it had already written for him. At work, Elijah was the man they called to direct even when he spoke gently. He was the man they labeled difficult when he simply asked the same questions white co-workers asked without issue. Whenever something went wrong, eyes shifted toward him before the truth even had a chance. And when he dared to point out the double standards, they sighed and said he was making everything about race, as if they were the ones living in his skin, as if they understood what it felt like to walk through every room already judged. One afternoon, Elijah was explaining a mistake on a project that wasn't his, calmly breaking down the facts, when his supervisor interrupted with a familiar line. "Elijah, you're overreacting. You're always so intense. Maybe you should work on your tone." His tone, always the tone, a weapon used against him every time he refused to shrink. He swallowed the frustration burning in his chest, because he knew how this would play out. If he pushed back, he'd be written off as aggressive. If he stayed quiet, he'd be walked over. Either way, he lost a piece of himself. He went back to his desk, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, wondering how many more pieces he had left before he had nothing to give. Outside of work, the world wasn't any softer. Elijah could feel the shift in body language whenever he walked near someone who didn't expect a black man to be anywhere, except on their TV screens or in their assumptions. He learned to watch the small things, how a woman gripped her purse tighter when he stepped into an elevator, how a man pretended not to stare but kept glancing until Elijah stepped out of his path, how two teenagers crossed the street when they saw him coming. None of it was new, none of it surprised him, but it wore on him in ways no one ever talked about, because it wasn't just the big, violent stories on the news. It was the everyday cut small, subtle, constant that left scars no one could see. One evening, Elijah stopped at a gas station after work. He was tired, hungry, and ready to get home. As he walked out, a police car rolled up beside him, lights off but purpose clear. An officer leaned out with that heavy, practiced stare. "Where you headed?" Elijah blinked. "Whom you live around here?" "Yes." "You sure? You look like someone we're trying to find." There it was. The line he'd heard before. The line generations of men like him had heard before. The line that turned his skin into a suspect. He kept his hands visible, voice steady. "I'm sure." The officer stared at him for a long moment, then nodded as if giving permission for Elijah to continue existing. The car rolled off, leaving him standing there with a familiar ache in his chest, an ache he'd learned to hide from the world. He got in his car and sat there for a minute, staring at the steering wheel, feeling the tremor he refused to show the officer. This was the part of black life no one wanted to admit still existed. Not the violence that made headlines, but the quiet pressure that lived in your muscles and bones, the tension that never fully released, the exhaustion of always being watched, corrected, dismissed, or doubted. And inside him, a war raged every single day. The urge to shout the truth, the urge to swallow it, the urge to protect his peace, the urge to defend his dignity, the urge to walk away from it all, the urge to stand his ground. It was a balance he'd been forced to learn as a child. Watching his father lower his voice around white men who talked to him like they owned the ground he stood on. Watching his mother smile politely through insults that would have broken anyone else. Watching his grandfather shake his head and say, "We carry more than they know, but we carry it because no one else ever did for us." Trauma didn't just live in memories. It lived in habits, in breath, in instincts passed down from one generation to the next. Elijah didn't want revenge. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He didn't want to be feared or judged or praised for surviving what should have never existed in the first place. He just wanted rest. He wanted fairness. He wanted to stop walking into every room feeling like he had to prove he belonged in a country his family helped build with sweat and grief. He wanted to be able to say, "I'm home," and have the world believe him. By the end of the week, Elijah's spirit felt heavy again. The weight was familiar, but it still stung. He craved a space where he could breathe without performing. And even though the church wasn't perfect, it was the one place he could sit in the back, close his eyes, and feel like the world wasn't chasing him for a moment. So that Sunday morning, Elijah walked up the steps of First Hope Baptist, pushing open the big wooden door. The sanctuary was already filling with people, quiet chatter echoing under the high ceiling. He nodded politely at a few faces, some warm, some pretending not to see him. He took his usual seat near the back, settling into the pew with a long, steadying breath. The choir hummed softly. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass, scattering colors across the room like a fragile promise. Elijah had no idea that Pastor Reeves, standing behind the curtain with trembling hands, was moments away from tearing the silence open. He had no idea that the truth buried for generations was about to rise. He had no idea that this morning, the preacher's voice would shake the town down to its roots. He just sat there, trying to find a little peace, unaware that his world and everyone else's was about to change. Pastor Reeves stepped out from behind the curtain like a man walking toward his own reckoning. His hands shook so visibly that a few people in the front row whispered to each other, wondering if he was sick. But it wasn't sickness. It was the weight of truth pressing against every beat of his heart. He gripped the pulpit, knuckles pale, eyes scanning a room filled mostly with white faces, families he'd baptized, married, prayed with, buried, people he'd known since childhood, people who trusted him to keep the peace, not disturb it. But peace built on silence wasn't peace at all, and he knew it. He cleared his throat, voice cracking before he even spoke. "Before I begin today's message, I need to tell you something I've been running from." The room stilled. Even the choir held their breath. Elijah, sitting in the back pew, felt a strange shift in the air. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, like the room itself was bracing for an earthquake. The preacher drew in a shaky breath. "I found documents, records stored in the church's archives. They've been there for decades. Letters, land, deeds, financial logs, and they reveal something I can't ignore anymore." A couple in the front row exchanged confused glances. An older man frowned. Someone coughed, anxious. Pastor Reeves swallowed hard. "This church benefited from the suffering of black families in this town." The words dropped like a stone in water, quiet at first, then rippling outward. Murmurs rose immediately. "What is he talking about? That can't be right. My grandfather helped build this church. He wasn't racist." But the preacher pressed on. "He had too. I found old letters written by the church elders. Letters describing how they worked with local officials to keep black families from buying homes near this building. They pressured the city to protect the area, even supported policies that forced black residents into certain neighborhoods, so white families could stay comfortable." Gasps burst across the sanctuary. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of worn papers, hands trembling. "These deeds show that land once owned by a black family was seized through intimidation, then donated to this church, and the church has been benefiting from it ever since." One woman covered her mouth, tears filling her eyes. A man shook his head violently, whispering, "No, no, no, that's not our history." Another man crossed his arms, jaw clenched, anger rising like steam. "This is nonsense. He's twisting things." But the preacher didn't flinch. "Not now," he continued, voice raw. "I read letters saying black folks were trouble, that we needed to avoid mixing communities, that the church had to stand firm against integration." He paused, eyes shining with shame. "I grew up admiring the men who wrote those words, men who told me this place was built on faith. But the truth is, part of it was built on fear, part of it was built on theft." The sanctuary erupted whispers, murmurs, outright denial. "My grandfather wasn't like that. This is political nonsense. You're trying to divide us. Why bring this up now?" But some people weren't arguing. They were staring at the floor, their faces pale, their hands shaking, as if somewhere deep down they already suspected the truth. Pastor Reeves bowed his head. "For years I preached forgiveness while living off the benefits of what was stolen from others. I spoke about justice without ever confronting the injustice that built this place. I told you to love your neighbors while ignoring the neighbors who were pushed out so we could build our sanctuary." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. He had never heard a white preacher speak like this, not with politics, not with pity, but with honesty. Painful, undeniable honesty. The preacher continued, voice growing steadier. even as his hands trembled. I have failed this community. I have failed the black members who walked through these doors hoping for equality. I have failed men like Elijah Carter, who sit quietly in the back, carrying weight this church helped create. Elijah froze. His name hadn't been spoken yet, but his presence suddenly felt exposed, like a spotlight had been placed on his pew. Some people turned to look at him, some with guilt, some with discomfort, some with denial already forming in their eyes. Pastor Reeves breathed deeply, as if preparing to jump off a cliff. I can't preach another word without telling you this. Our church benefited from stolen land, from discriminatory policies, from fear-driven decisions, and many of us, myself included, pretended it wasn't our problem. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. Then he said the words that pulled the air out of the room. This church owes black families more than silence, more than sympathy. We owe them truth, and truth demands accountability. A wave of shock rippled through the congregation. One woman burst into tears. Another stood abruptly and whispered harshly to her husband, "Get your things. We're leaving." A man near the front clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles went white. A teenager stared at the pastor with wide eyes, caught between disbelief and awakening. Half the room looked ready to erupt. The other half looked ready to collapse. But Elijah just sat there, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Validation. Not pity, not charity. Truth. Someone was finally saying the words. Black families in that town had carried without anyone willing to listen. Pastor Reeves looked across the room, sweat on his brow, trembling but unbroken. He wasn't preaching anymore. He was confessing. He was exposing his own history, his own failures, his own comfortable silence. And then, in a moment that made the whole sanctuary fall into stunned stillness, he turned and looked directly at Elijah. Their eyes locked. The weight of centuries hung between them, and with a voice that cracked but didn't waver, the preacher said, "This country owes you more than an apology." The room froze. Every whisper died. Every denial stopped. Every pair of eyes turned to Elijah. Because the truth had finally been spoken aloud, and there was no going back. The preacher's confession doesn't stay in the church, it explodes through the town like wildfire within hours. He becomes the center of a storm. Some white residents hiss that he's a traitor who betrayed his own people. Others insist he's exaggerating, claiming that was a long time ago. Let it go. A few demand he resign immediately, furious that he dug up scenes they hoped would stay buried deep. And Elijah, even though he didn't speak a single word, he becomes a silent target. Whispers trail him in grocery aisles. Eyes narrow when he walks down the street. People who used to smile now look away, as if he's suddenly responsible for truths they don't want to hear. We reveal a painful contradiction. Everyone says they want fairness until fairness requires sacrifice, until it forces them to face the benefits they inherited from someone else's suffering. But underneath the noise, something unexpected begins to grow. A small, diverse group of young people, black, white, and brown, step forward. They say the town can't heal if it keeps pretending nothing's wrong. They want accountability, honesty, and a future not built on silence. Meanwhile, Elijah wrestles with a deeper battle. All the hurt he's swallowed for years rises back up. He feels the weight of every moment he stayed quiet just to survive. Now, standing at a crossroads, he must decide, will he speak publicly with the preacher, risking everything, or return to the safety of the shadows, where pain is familiar but change is impossible? The preacher and Elijah choose not to hide anymore. No church walls, no podiums, no politics. They gather the town in an open space, just people, standing face to face with the truth. Elijah steps forward first. His voice shakes, but he speaks anyway. He shares the stories he once buried, the humiliation his father endured at job sites, the threats his mother received when she tried to register to vote, the land his grandmother said their family once owned, taken through legal paperwork that was anything but legal. For the first time, the town hears the weight he's been carrying not as news, but as inheritance. Then the preacher speaks, his voice steady with conviction. He admits that silence, especially from people with power, can wound deeper than open hatred, and he confesses that he will never again call himself a man of God if he's too afraid to protect God's children. Gradually, the crowd begins to shift, not all at once, not perfectly. Some people listen with eyes wide open, hearing truths they'd never bothered to ask about. Some cross their arms, uncomfortable but unable to look away. And a few feel tears rising not from guilt, but from finally understanding what they were never taught. It is not a miracle, it is not a transformation, but it is real. A quiet recognition settles over the gathering. History doesn't disappear just because people were too uncomfortable to face it. And healing can't begin until the truth is spoken out loud. Weeks pass, and the town begins to shift not with speeches, but with action. Old policies are rewritten. New community programs form, focused on fairness, equity, and acknowledgement rather than denial. Volunteers comb through decades of land records, tracing what was taken and from whom. For the first time, the town openly discusses restitution not as charity, but as responsibility. It's far from perfect. People still argue, some resist, some pretend not to see the progress at all. But the silence, the heavy, suffocating silence that protected injustice for generations, is finally gone. One quiet morning, Elijah stands outside the church steps. The air feels lighter. He feels something he hasn't felt in years. Room to breathe. The preacher joins him. He's lost friends, status, and comfort but gained purpose. He tells Elijah softly, truth may hurt, but lies destroy everything they touch. Elijah looks at the town still flawed, still learning, and realizes something powerful. Change doesn't come from heroes. It comes from ordinary people choosing courage over convenience. We close with a strong emotional message. Justice isn't a moment. Accountability isn't an attack. And America cannot move forward if it keeps burying the past under excuses and denial. The final words honor the unbreakable resilience of black people, those who carried pain they never chose, fought battles they never wanted, and still found the strength to hope. And as the sun rises over the church, one truth becomes clear. Real change begins in the most unexpected places, often with the people we least expect choosing to do what's right.